Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Maxwell's demon, the tiny creature that could break the universe. Imagine a box divided into two halves by a partition. The partition has a small door operated by a tiny intelligent being, a demon as physicist James Clerk Maxwell called it in 1867. And the box contains gas molecules bouncing around randomly, some moving fast and some moving slow. Hot molecules and cold molecules mix together, and the demon, perched at the door, watches the molecules approach and makes decisions. When a fast-moving hot molecule approaches from the left, the demon opens the door and lets it pass to the right. And when a slow-moving cold molecule approaches from the right, the demon opens the door and lets it pass to the left. And when molecules moving in the wrong directions approach, the demon keeps the door closed. And over time, this sorting process concentrates hot molecules on the right side and cold molecules on the left side, creating a temperature difference without any energy input, just the demon's intelligence and careful timing. And once a temperature difference exists, it could be used to run a heat engine, to extract work, to power machines. And this seems to create energy from nothing, seems to violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that heat flows from hot to cold, and never the reverse without work being done. And so, Maxwell's demon presents a paradox, a thought experiment, where intelligence appears to defeat fundamental physical law, where information and cleverness seem to allow perpetual motion. And this puzzle troubled physicists for over a century, until the resolution emerged from understanding the relationship between information and thermodynamics. Visualize the demon at work, watching molecules approach, each molecule carrying kinetic energy, moving at some velocity determined by temperature. And the demon perceives each molecule, measures its speed, decides whether to open or close the door, and executes the decision perfectly. And after many such operations, the gas on the right is hotter than the gas on the left. Entropy has decreased in the gas. Order has emerged from disorder, and this seems impossible because the second law of thermodynamics is supposed to be universal, supposed to apply to all closed systems, and the box with the demon should be a closed system. No energy enters or leaves, and yet entropy decreases, and if entropy can decrease, then the second law is violated, and if the second law can be violated, then all of thermodynamics collapses. Heat engines could run at impossible efficiencies. Refrigerators could cool without power input. The universe's arrow of time could reverse, and physics as we know it breaks down. The resolution emerged gradually through the work of several physicists, including Leo Szilard, Leon Brillouin, and Charles Bennett. And the key insight is that the demon must gather information about the molecules, must measure their velocities, must store this information in memory. And these operations have thermodynamic costs. The demon's brain or computer or measuring device must interact with the molecules to measure them, and this interaction dissipates energy. And more importantly, the demon's memory fills up with information about past measurements, and eventually the memory must be erased to make room for new measurements. And Rolf Landauer proved in 1961 that erasing information has a fundamental minimum thermodynamic cost. Erasing one bit of information requires dissipating at least a certain amount of heat proportional to temperature. And this heat generation increases the entropy of the environment. And when the entropy increase from information erasure is included in the accounting, the total entropy of the system plus demon never decreases. The second law is preserved. The demon cannot create a perpetual motion machine because the cost of gathering and erasing information exactly compensates for the entropy decrease in the gas. Imagine the demon's memory as a tape with bits that record whether each molecule was fast or slow. And as the demon sorts molecules, the tape fills up. 0 for slow molecule, 1 for fast molecule, and the tape grows longer and longer. And eventually, the demon runs out of memory space and must erase the tape to continue operating. And the erasure process, Landauer showed, must dump heat into the environment, must increase entropy elsewhere. And the entropy increase from erasure is at least as large as the entropy decrease from sorting, and so the net change in entropy is 0 or positive, never negative. And the second law holds: the demon cannot beat thermodynamics. Intelligence and information do not provide a loophole. They are themselves subject to thermodynamic constraints, and information is physical, has energy costs, has entropy, and cannot be manipulated freely without thermodynamic consequences. The paradox and its resolution have profound implications for computer science, for the theory of computation, for the relationship between information and physics. Because Landauer's principle establishes that computation has fundamental physical limits, that there is a minimum energy cost for irreversible operations like erasing bits, and this cost sets a lower bound on the energy consumption of any computer. And it explains why computers generate heat, why data centers require enormous cooling systems, why information processing is not free, and it unifies information theory and thermodynamics, showing that bits and entropy are connected, that forgetting information has thermodynamic consequences, that memory erasure increases disorder in the universe. Maxwell's demon also appears in discussions of the arrow of time, the question of why time flows forward, why we remember the past but not the future, why causes precede effects. And the second law of thermodynamics provides an answer: entropy increases, and this increase defines a direction for time. And if Maxwell's demon could violate the second law, then the arrow of time could reverse, the past and future could become symmetric, and the resolution of the demon paradox reinforces the second law, confirms that entropy really does always increase when all systems, including observers and their memories, are accounted for. And this grounds the arrow of time in fundamental physics, connects our subjective experience of time's flow to objective thermodynamic processes. The demon has also inspired practical research into nanoscale systems and molecular machines, because modern technology approaches the scale where Maxwell's demon scenarios become relevant, where individual molecules can be manipulated, where quantum effects and thermal fluctuations dominate, and researchers have built experimental realizations of Maxwell's demon using feedback control, using sensors and actuators to sort particles or extract work from thermal fluctuations. And these experiments confirm Landauer's principle, confirm that information processing has thermodynamic costs, and they explore the limits of miniaturization, the minimum size and energy consumption of computers, and the ultimate efficiency of engines and refrigerators. The tiny demon sits at the door, watching molecules, sorting them, concentrating energy, and for a moment it seems to defeat the second law, seems to create order from chaos. But the illusion fades when the full system is considered, when the demon's memory and the information it gathers are included, when the cost of erasure is accounted for, and the second law stands, unbroken, universal, and the demon, far from being a threat to thermodynamics, becomes a tool for understanding it. A thought experiment that revealed deep connections between information and entropy, between computation and physics, between what we know and what we can do, and Maxwell's demon endures, not as a paradox, but as a solved problem with profound implications, a puzzle that took over a century to fully resolve, and a reminder that even the most abstract thought experiments can illuminate fundamental truths about the physical world, about the nature of information, about the limits of what is possible, and about the deep unity between different branches of physics, between thermodynamics and information theory, between entropy and knowledge, and the demon remains, a fixture in physics pedagogy, a symbol of the power of thought experiments, and a monument to the principle that information is physical, that knowledge has costs, and that nothing, not even intelligence, escapes the iron laws of thermodynamics. Moore's paradox. The philosopher G. E. Moore identified a peculiar class of statements that seem absurd or irrational to assert, even though they may be true. And these statements take the form, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," or "I believe it is raining, but it is not raining." And these statements, while not logical contradictions, strike us as deeply strange, as something no rational person would say. And this strangeness is Moore's paradox, a puzzle about the relationship between belief, assertion, and truth that has implications for epistemology, the philosophy of language, and the nature of self-knowledge. Consider the statement, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," and suppose this statement is true. It really is raining, and the speaker genuinely does not believe it. Perhaps they are looking out the window, but not paying attention, or they are in a state of denial. And so the two conjuncts are both true, and there is no logical contradiction. The world can be such that it is raining, and such that someone does not believe it is raining. And yet if someone asserts this statement, if they say out loud, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," the assertion seems absurd, self-defeating, almost incoherent. And the absurdity does not lie in the content of the statement, which may be true, but in the act of asserting it, in the pragmatic dimension of language use. The paradox arises because assertion carries an implicit commitment to belief. When someone asserts that P they normally implicate, even if they do not explicitly state that they believe P, that they take P to be true, and so asserting it is raining implicates that the speaker believes it is raining, but the second conjunct explicitly denies this belief, and so the assertion as a whole both implicates and denies that the speaker believes it is raining, and this creates a pragmatic contradiction, a clash not between the truth conditions of the statement, but between the commitments carried by different parts of the assertion. Ludwig Wittgenstein famously analysed Moore's paradox, arguing that it reveals something important about the grammar of belief, about the way belief and assertion are related, and Wittgenstein suggested that saying "I believe P" is not a report of an inner mental state, not a description of something going on in the mind, but rather a different way of asserting P, a way of committing oneself to P with a certain degree of caution or tentativeness. And if this is right, then I believe it is raining, but it is not raining is paradoxical because it both asserts and denies the same thing. It commits to the truth of the proposition while simultaneously withdrawing that commitment. Others have analysed the paradox in terms of rational constraints on belief and assertion, arguing that rationality requires a certain coherence between one's beliefs and one's assertions. That if you assert P, you should believe P, and if you believe P, you should regard P as true. And so asserting it is raining, but I do not believe it is raining violates these coherence requirements. It displays a kind of epistemic irrationality, a failure to properly integrate one's assertions with one's beliefs, even if the statement itself is not logically contradictory. The paradox also has a dual form involving belief rather than assertion. Consider the statement, "I believe it is raining, but it is not raining." And again, this may be true. Someone can believe something false, but believing this conjunction seems irrational, because if you believe the first conjunct, that you believe it is raining, and you also believe the second conjunct, that it is not raining, then you are aware that one of your beliefs is false, yet you continue to hold both beliefs. And this seems like a paradigm case of irrationality, holding contradictory beliefs while being fully aware of the contradiction. The more paradoxical statements reveal a kind of blindness that rational agents have about their own beliefs. You cannot rationally believe "I believe P, but not P," even though this statement may be true, because believing it requires simultaneously believing P. Since you believe that you believe P, and beliefs about your own beliefs are generally reliable, and believing not P, which is the second conjunct, and so you end up believing both P and not P, which is a straightforward contradiction. And so the more paradoxical belief collapses into an ordinary contradiction when believed, even though it is not a contradiction when merely entertained or stated by someone else. The paradox connects to issues about self-knowledge and the transparency of belief, the idea that we have a special kind of access to our own mental states, that we know what we believe in a way that is different from how we know what others believe. And Moore's paradox suggests that this access is not merely causal or empirical, but involves a kind of rational or conceptual connection, that there are norms governing the relationship between belief and self-ascription of belief, norms that make certain combinations of beliefs irrational even when they are not logically contradictory. The paradox also appears in contexts involving other propositional attitudes. There are more paradoxical statements involving knowledge, such as P is true, but I do not know it, which seem strange to assert even though they may be true. There are billions of truths that any given person does not know, and there are versions involving desire, intention, and other mental states, each revealing similar tensions between the attitude and the self-ascription of that attitude. Some philosophers have argued that Moore's paradox reveals the limits of a purely truth-conditional semantics, the view that the meaning of a sentence is fully captured by its truth conditions, by the conditions under which it is true or false. Because more paradoxical sentences have clear truth conditions, they are true when both conjuncts are true, and yet they are assertorically defective. They cannot be rationally asserted, and this suggests that meaning involves more than truth conditions, that it includes pragmatic dimensions, norms of assertion, and the commitments that speakers undertake when they use language. Others have explored formal models of Moore's paradox using epistemic logic and doxastic logic, systems that formalize reasoning about knowledge and belief. And these formal models can represent the structure of more paradoxical statements and prove that they are not logically contradictory, while also showing why they lead to incoherence when believed or asserted. And this formal work has illuminated the structure of the paradox and connected it to other puzzles in epistemic logic, such as the knowability paradox and the surprise examination paradox. Moore's paradox remains a touchstone in philosophy of mind and language, a simple puzzle that continues to generate insights about the nature of belief, the norms of assertion, the structure of self-knowledge, and the relationship between logic and rationality. And it stands as a reminder that coherence and consistency are more complex than they first appear, that there are ways of being irrational that do not involve believing logical contradictions, that the pragmatics of language use constrain what can be rationally asserted in ways that go beyond the truth or falsity of what is said, and that the relationship between mind and world, between belief and truth, between what we think and what we say, is mediated by norms and commitments that are not fully captured by the formal apparatus of logic. And the statement sits there: it is raining. But I do not believe it is raining. True perhaps, yet absurd, unsayable, a combination of words that no rational speaker would utter. And the paradox persists, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophy, a puzzle that illuminates the boundaries of rational thought, the limits of self-knowledge, and the strange logic that governs the relationship between belief and assertion, between what we think and what we can coherently say about what we think. Olbers's paradox: why the night sky is dark when it should blaze with light. Look up at the night sky and you see darkness, scattered stars against a black background, empty space between the points of light. And this seems natural, seems obvious. The sky's dark because there are not many stars, because most of space is empty. But in an infinite, eternal universe filled with stars, this darkness becomes paradoxical, becomes something that should not exist. And this is Olber's paradox, named after German astronomer Heinrich Wilhelm Olbers, who discussed it in 1823, though the puzzle was recognized earlier by others, including Johannes Kepler and Edmund Halley, and the paradox asks why the night sky is dark, when simple reasoning suggests it should be blazing bright as the surface of the sun in every direction. The argument proceeds as follows. If the universe is infinite in spatial extent and has existed forever, and if stars are distributed roughly uniformly throughout this infinite space, then every line of sight from Earth, extended far enough, must eventually intersect the surface of a star, because in an infinite universe, with infinite stars, every direction contains a star somewhere along that sight line, perhaps nearby or perhaps trillions of light years away, but somewhere, and so the entire sky should be covered with stellar surfaces, should glow with the brightness of a star, and there should be no dark spaces, no black background, only light, and yet we see darkness. We see mostly empty space with occasional bright stars, and this contradiction is Olbers' paradox. Visualize the reasoning more carefully. Imagine dividing the universe into concentric shells around Earth, like layers of an onion, each shell at a different distance, and count how many stars are in each shell. A shell at distance r has volume proportional to r squared times the shell thickness, because the surface area of a sphere grows as r squared, and if stars are uniformly distributed, then the number of stars in the shell is proportional to r squared. But the brightness of each individual star falls off as 1 over r squared due to the inverse square law of light. Light spreads out as it travels, and so the total brightness contributed by all stars in a given shell is the number of stars times the brightness per star, which is r squared times 1 over r squared. And these factors cancel, and each shell contributes the same total brightness regardless of distance. And since there are infinitely many shells in an infinite universe, the total brightness is infinite, and the sky should be infinitely bright. And even if we account for stars blocking each other, eventually every sight line intersects a star, and the sky should glow uniformly with the brightness of stellar surfaces. The resolution of Olbers' paradox involves recognizing that the universe is not infinite and eternal in the way the paradox assumes. Modern cosmology tells us that the universe has a finite age, about 13.8 billion years, and light travels at a finite speed, and so we can only see light from stars within our observable horizon, stars whose light has had time to reach us. And this limits the number of stars we can see, and more importantly, the universe is expanding, and distant stars are receding from us, and their light is redshifted, stretched to longer wavelengths and lower energies by the expansion of space. And this redshift dims distant starlight. And for sufficiently distant stars, the redshift is so extreme that their light is shifted into the infrared or radio spectrum, invisible to our eyes. And the combination of finite age and cosmological expansion means that only a finite amount of starlight reaches us, and the night sky is dark. Not because stars are sparse, but because the universe has not existed long enough for light from all stars to reach us, and because expansion dims the light from distant sources. Another factor is the finite lifetime of stars. Stars are not eternal. They form, they shine for millions or billions of years, and they die. And in a finite age universe, not all regions have had time to form stars, and not all stars have been shining throughout cosmic history, and so the background radiation from stars is further reduced. And these factors combine to ensure that the night sky is dark despite the vast number of stars in the universe. The paradox also touches on thermodynamics and equilibrium, because if the universe were infinite, eternal, and static, with stars distributed uniformly, then eventually the radiation from all these stars would fill space uniformly. Space would reach thermal equilibrium with stellar surfaces, and everything would be at the same temperature as the surface of a star, about 6,000 degrees Kelvin, and Earth would be vaporized, life would be impossible, and the darkness of the night sky is evidence that the universe is not in thermal equilibrium, is not static and eternal, but is instead dynamic, expanding, and young. Olbers's paradox played a role in the development of modern cosmology. It was one piece of evidence that the universe cannot be static and eternal, that something must be different about the large-scale structure of space and time. And when Edwin Hubble discovered in the 1920s that the universe is expanding, that distant galaxies are receding from us, this provided a natural resolution to Olbers' paradox. The expansion redshifts and dims distant light, preventing the accumulation of infinite brightness, and the finite age of the universe, confirmed by observations of the cosmic microwave background and the distribution of galaxies, completes the resolution, ensuring that we see only a finite amount of cosmic history, only the light from stars within our past light cone. The paradox also has poetic resonance. It asks why there is darkness, why night exists, why space is not filled with light. And the answer is that darkness is a consequence of time and change, of the universe having a beginning, of stars being born and dying, of space expanding and carrying light away. And darkness becomes not an absence, but a presence, not a void, but a canvas. Evidence of cosmic history, evidence of the dynamic, evolving universe we inhabit. And the dark night sky, far from being empty or boring, is rich with information. Tells us about the finite age of the cosmos, about the expansion of space, about the distribution and evolution of stars and galaxies. And Olbers' paradox, resolved but not forgotten, remains a reminder that even simple observations, like the darkness of night, can contain profound mysteries, can require deep theories to explain, and can reveal fundamental truths about the nature of the universe. The stars shine against the darkness, scattered lights in an empty sky, and the darkness itself is meaningful, is informative, is the signature of a finite age expanding universe. And Olbers' paradox, resolved by modern cosmology, endures as a teaching tool, as an illustration of how seemingly simple questions can have complex answers, and as a monument to the human capacity to wonder about the ordinary, to see puzzles where others see only the familiar, and to pursue those puzzles until the universe reveals its secrets. Russell's paradox. In the year 1901, a young mathematician named Bertrand Russell discovered a contradiction so profound that it shattered the foundations of mathematics and forced an entire generation of logicians to rebuild their discipline from the ground up. And this contradiction became known as Russell's paradox, a simple question about sets that revealed a fatal flaw in the way mathematicians understood collections and categories. A set is merely a collection of objects, and sets can contain anything: numbers, colours, ideas, even other sets. And at first this seems harmless enough. A set of all chairs, a set of all prime numbers, a set of all books ever written. Some sets contain themselves as members and some do not. And this too seems straightforward. A catalogue of all catalogues would include itself because it is also a catalogue, while a list of all fruit does not include itself because a list is not a fruit. Russell posed a deceptively innocent question. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? And the mind stumbles immediately into contradiction. If the set contains itself, then by definition it should not contain itself, because the rule states it only includes sets that do not contain themselves. But if it does not contain itself, then it must include itself, because it fits the criteria perfectly. And so the paradox loops without end, a perfect logical knot that cannot be untied. This was not merely a clever riddle or a philosophical curiosity, it was a disaster for mathematics, because at the time, mathematicians believed they could organise all of mathematical knowledge using set theory, a system proposed by Georg Cantor that treated sets as the fundamental building blocks of reality. But Russell's paradox proved that naive set theory was inconsistent, that it allowed contradictions to exist within its structure, and if contradictions are permitted, then anything can be proven true or false, rendering the entire system useless. Russell himself compared the paradox to a barber in a village who shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. And the question arises, does the barber shave himself? And if he does, then he should not, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not, then he must, because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. And the loop tightens again. Mathematicians scrambled to patch the damage, and various solutions emerged over the following decades. Zermelo and Frankel developed a new version of set theory that imposed strict rules about which sets could exist, forbidding the kind of self-reference that allowed Russell's paradox to form, while type theory introduced hierarchies that prevented sets from containing themselves by assigning different logical levels to different kinds of objects. Others embraced paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions without collapse, or rejected the entire project of grounding mathematics in set theory, seeking new foundations altogether. Russell's paradox also influenced philosophy beyond mathematics, touching on questions of language, meaning, and self-reference, revealing that not all grammatically correct statements are logically coherent, that some sentences create traps from which reason cannot escape. The paradox appears in unexpected places. In computer science, where recursive definitions can cause programs to crash, in legal systems where laws reference themselves in contradictory ways, in everyday thought whenever categories attempt to classify themselves. It stands as a reminder that even the most rigorous systems of thought contain limits, that logic itself is not immune to paradox, that the quest for certainty and completeness may be forever haunted by statements that twist back on themselves and devour their own meaning. The Abilene Paradox: Why Groups Choose What Nobody Wants. A family sits on a porch in Coleman, Texas, on a hot afternoon, comfortable, playing dominoes, and the father-in-law suggests driving to Abilene for dinner, 53 miles away in a car without air conditioning. And the suggestion is not enthusiastic, is tentative, but the son-in-law says sure, sounds good. Not because he wants to go, but because he assumes others want to go, and he wants to be agreeable. And the wife says yes if you all want to go, and the mother-in-law says of course, and they all pile into the car and drive to Abilene in dusty heat, arrive hot and tired, eat mediocre food, drive back exhausted, and sitting on the porch again, someone admits they didn't really want to go, and then everyone admits they didn't want to go, admits they only agreed because they thought others wanted it, and the entire group took an action that no individual wanted, chose an outcome that everyone preferred to avoid. And this is the Abilene Paradox, described by management professor Jerry Harvey, a phenomenon where groups make decisions that contradict the preferences of all members, where collective action diverges from individual preferences, not through majority rule or compromise, but through misperception, through failure to communicate, through assumptions about what others want. And the paradox reveals that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be unwanted by everyone. And the Abilene Paradox shows a different kind of collective irrationality from Condorcet cycles or voting paradoxes, shows irrationality that arises from social dynamics, from conformity pressure, from reluctance to dissent. And the paradox remains relevant for understanding group decision-making, for recognizing that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through false consensus, through everyone going along with what nobody wants. Imagine the psychology of each family member. Each sits on the porch comfortable, each prefers staying home, but each hears the suggestion and thinks, well, if someone is suggesting it, they must want it. I don't want to be the one who ruins everyone's plans. I should be agreeable. Go along, be a team player. And so each agrees despite preferring to stay, and no one voices their actual preference. No one says I'd rather stay home. And the group collectively creates a false impression, creates the appearance of consensus when none exists, and everyone interprets others' agreement as reflecting genuine preference rather than social accommodation. And this mutual misperception drives the group toward an outcome no one wants. And the paradox unfolds. The trip is taken. the unwanted dinner eaten, and only afterward does truth emerge. Does communication clarify that everyone preferred staying home, and the group confronts the absurdity, the recognition that they did something no one wanted through failure to communicate authentically? The Abilene paradox differs from groupthink, where group members genuinely conform their preferences to the group, genuinely come to believe the group view. And Abilene involves no genuine preference change, involves only misperception, only assumption about what others want. And members maintain their private preferences, but suppress them out of social pressure, out of desire to be agreeable. And this suppression is the source of the paradox, creates the gap between public agreement and private preference, and the gap allows groups to pursue actions that everyone opposes. And breaking the paradox requires someone to voice dissent, to say, actually, I'd prefer not to go. And this dissent can reveal that others feel the same, can break the false consensus, but dissent is risky, is socially uncomfortable, requires challenging what appears to be group preference. And most people avoid this, prefer to go along, and the paradox persists. Visualize the Abilene paradox as a coordination failure, where the optimal outcome requires everyone to reveal their true preferences, requires honest communication, but social norms and psychological tendencies prevent this, create pressure toward agreement, toward accommodation, toward not rocking the boat. And these pressures are strongest when relationships matter, when group harmony is valued, when dissent risks social costs and family dinners and work teams and community groups all face Abilene risks. All can make decisions that no one wants through false consensus, through failure to communicate authentically. And the paradox shows that agreement is not always good, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, that groups need mechanisms for authentic communication, need cultures that encourage dissent, need permission to disagree. One lesson from the Abilene paradox is the importance of honest communication, of creating environments where people feel safe expressing disagreement, where dissent is welcomed rather than punished. And organizations that suffer repeated Abilene paradoxes often have cultures of false harmony, have norms that discourage challenging proposals, have leaders who interpret dissent as disloyalty, and these cultures create conditions for Abilene, create pressure toward agreement, and preventing the paradox requires changing culture, requires valuing truth over harmony, requires encouraging people to voice concerns. And this is difficult, requires conscious effort, requires leadership that models disagreement, that rewards dissent, that avoids shooting messengers. Another lesson is about decision-making procedures, about how groups can avoid Abilene through structured processes, through anonymous voting, through devil's advocate roles, through explicit checking for consensus, through asking not just who agrees, but who disagrees and why. And these procedures create space for dissent, create permission to voice opposition, and reduce pressure toward false consensus. And effective groups use these procedures systematically, build them into decision-making, recognize that surface agreement may hide opposition, and these procedures are especially important for high-stakes decisions, for commitments that are costly to reverse. And the trip to Abilene is costly, is unpleasant for everyone, and could have been avoided with better communication. The Abilene paradox also appears in organizational settings, in corporations where teams pursue strategies that no one really supports, in committees that adopt policies no member wants, in groups that invest in projects everyone privately doubts. And these organizational Abilenes are costly, waste resources, damage morale, produce outcomes that serve no one's interests. And preventing them requires organizational awareness, requires training people to recognize Abilene dynamics, requires creating cultures where speaking up is safe, where dissent is valued, and many organizations fail at this. Have cultures of deference, have hierarchies, where subordinates agree with superiors even when privately opposed. And these cultures are Abilene-prone, create repeated paradoxes, and organizational effectiveness requires breaking these patterns. Some argue that the Abilene paradox is overstated, that genuine cases are rare, that most group decisions reflect genuine preferences of at least some members, and while everyone agreeing despite everyone opposing is uncommon, partial Abilene is more common, where some members oppose but remain silent, and the group pursues a course that a vocal minority supports while a silent majority opposes, and this partial Abilene is still problematic, still produces suboptimal outcomes, and preventing it still requires encouraging dissent, requires creating safety for opposition. The paradox also raises questions about responsibility, about who is responsible when groups make decisions no one wants, and the answer is everyone and no one. Everyone contributed through silence, through false agreement, through failure to voice opposition, but no one individually caused the outcome. No one individually chose wrongly. Each made a reasonable social decision to accommodate perceived group preferences, and the collective outcome is worse than any individual action merited. And this shows how social dynamics can produce results that exceed individual culpability, can create group failures that no individual intended. And avoiding such failures requires collective awareness, requires group-level solutions, requires changing communication patterns and decision procedures. The family sits on the porch afterward, hot and tired and annoyed, and someone admits they didn't want to go, and the admissions cascade. And everyone realizes the absurdity, realizes they collectively did something no one wanted, and the Abilene paradox is revealed, and laughter mixes with frustration, and the lesson is learned. The importance of honest communication, the danger of false consensus, the need to voice dissent, and the paradox remains a permanent reminder that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through excessive agreeableness, through mistaken assumptions about others' preferences, through social pressures that suppress authentic communication, and the Abilene paradox endures as a cautionary tale about group decision-making, a demonstration that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, and that preventing collective irrationality requires creating environments where dissent is safe, where truth is valued over harmony, and where groups communicate authentically rather than accommodating falsely. The arrow paradox. Motion seems so simple, so obvious. An arrow flies through the air from bow to target, and no one doubts that it moves. Yet the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea posed a question that has troubled thinkers for over 2,000 years. A question about whether motion is even possible at all. And this is the arrow paradox, one of Zeno's many arguments against the reality of change and multiplicity. Consider an arrow in flight, frozen at a single instant of time. At that precise moment, the arrow occupies a specific region of space exactly equal to its own length and width. It is not in two places at once. It is simply where it is motionless, static, indistinguishable from an arrow at rest. At the next instant, the same is true. The arrow occupies a space equal to itself, motionless at that frozen moment, and at the next instant, and the next. And if time is composed of a sequence of such instants, then at every instant the arrow is motionless. And if the arrow is motionless at every instant, then how can it be said to move at all? For motion would require the arrow to be in more than one place at a single instant, or to be in a state of transition rather than a state of rest, and yet at any given instant there is no motion, only position. Zeno used this paradox to support the Eleatic philosophy of Parmenides, which held that change and motion are illusions, that reality is a single, unchanging whole, and that the apparent diversity and movement we perceive are mere deceptions of the senses. The arrow paradox strikes at the very concept of instantaneous velocity, the idea that an object has a speed at a single moment in time, and Aristotle attempted to refute Zeno by arguing that time is not composed of indivisible instants, but is continuous, that motion is not a series of static positions, but a process that unfolds over intervals, and that the paradox arises only if we mistakenly treat time as a collection of frozen moments, rather than a flowing continuum. Modern physics offers a different resolution through calculus, where velocity is defined as the derivative of position with respect to time, a limit that describes how position changes as the time interval approaches zero. And in this framework, instantaneous velocity is a well-defined concept. The arrow does have a speed at each moment, even though speed is not a property that can be observed in a single instant, but only inferred from the relationship between position and time. Yet some philosophers argue that the arrow paradox still points to something genuine and unresolved, a mystery about how the static and the dynamic relate, how a series of stillnesses can add up to motion, how being in a place can somehow become moving between places. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to the puzzle, because at the subatomic level, particles do not have definite positions and velocities simultaneously. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that the more precisely we know a particle's position, the less precisely we can know its momentum. And in some sense, the arrow paradox prefigures this strange quantum behavior, the idea that motion and position are not entirely compatible descriptions of reality. The paradox also connects to debates about the nature of time itself, whether time is discrete or continuous, whether it flows or is an illusion, whether the present moment is all that exists or whether past and future are equally real, and whether change is fundamental or derivative. Zeno's arrow hangs suspended in thought, motionless at every instant, yet undeniably in flight, a puzzle that refuses to vanish despite millennia of analysis, a reminder that even the most basic experiences, the flight of an arrow, the passing of time, the reality of motion, rest on assumptions that can be questioned, that beneath the surface of the obvious lies a tangle of conceptual difficulties that no amount of mathematics or physics has entirely smoothed away, and the arrow flies still, or perhaps it never moved at all, frozen forever in the paradox that bears its name. The Bell spaceship paradox. When two rockets pull a string apart, two identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the two ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that two different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame. And if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument. From the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment, and in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer, and growing, because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted, And so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch, and the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking. And so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor. And when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation, the distance measured by rulers that move with them. And the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship. And initially, there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now, the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting, because the markers are in motion relative to the ships, and so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity, the idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation. But this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating. And this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. Even though the ships never changed their coordinate separation, and this breaking is real, is frame independent, all observers agree that the thread broke. Though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break, and the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned, that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The bootstrap paradox. There exists a strange loop in time where cause and effect chase each other in a circle, where information or objects appear from nowhere, with no origin, no creator, no beginning, and this is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a paradox that emerges whenever time travel creates a causal loop that has no starting point. Imagine a time traveler who loves a particular symphony, and one day they decide to travel back in time to meet the composer, but when they arrive in the past, they discover that the composer has not yet written the symphony, and so the time traveler, eager to hear the music again, writes down the notes from memory and gives them to the composer, who then publishes it as their own work, and the symphony becomes famous, and years later the time traveler hears it and falls in love with it and decides to travel back in time to meet the composer, and the loop is complete. The question that haunts this scenario is simple and unanswerable. Who actually composed the symphony? The composer received it from the time traveler, and the time traveler received it from the composer, and neither of them created it. The information simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again, with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no author. The bootstrap paradox differs from the grandfather paradox because it does not involve contradiction. The timeline is perfectly self-consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no clash between cause and effect, and yet something feels deeply wrong, an intuition that things must come from somewhere. That information cannot simply exist without being created. The paradox appears in many variations: a book that writes itself, a watch that is given to a younger version of oneself, who then keeps it for decades before giving it back, a technology that is brought from the future and used to invent itself, and in each case the object or information becomes eternal, trapped in a loop of time, aging perhaps, but never truly beginning or ending. Some physicists accept the bootstrap paradox as a genuine possibility if time travel is real, arguing that closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, are permitted by general relativity under certain conditions, and that such loops might allow for causally self-sufficient systems where the past and future are mutually dependent. Others find the paradox deeply troubling, a sign that something is wrong with our understanding of causation, entropy, or time itself. Because information in a loop would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that order does not arise spontaneously from disorder, and yet in a bootstrap loop, the information appears to be perfectly preserved, never degrading, never increasing in entropy, existing in a kind of timeless stasis. The many worlds interpretation offers one way out, suggesting that the time traveler who delivers the symphony creates a new branch of reality, and that in their original timeline, the symphony had a different origin, but this solution feels like cheating, multiplying universes to avoid the discomfort of the loop. The bootstrap paradox forces confrontation with deep questions about the nature of causation, whether causes must always precede effects, whether the universe permits closed causal loops, and whether existence itself requires an ultimate origin, or whether some things can simply be eternal and self-caused, through time without beginning or end, defying the intuition that everything must come from something, that there must always be a first cause, a prime mover, a starting point from which all else flows. The Chinese room argument, why understanding takes more than following rules. A philosopher sits alone in a room, and through a slot in the door come pieces of paper with Chinese characters written on them, and the philosopher does not understand Chinese, cannot read the characters, has no idea what they mean, but the philosopher has a rule book, an enormous book of instructions written in English that specifies for every possible input what output to produce, and the rules are purely syntactic. Say things like, if you receive these characters, then copy these other characters onto paper and send them out. And the philosopher follows the rules mechanically, receives Chinese input, looks up the appropriate response in the rule book, writes the Chinese characters, and sends the paper out through the slot. And to outside observers who understand Chinese, the responses are perfect, are indistinguishable from responses a native Chinese speaker would give. The system appears to understand Chinese, appears to be conversing intelligently, and yet the philosopher inside understands nothing, is merely manipulating symbols according to formal rules. And this is John Searle's Chinese room argument, proposed in 1980 as a challenge to strong AI, to the claim that running the right program is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and the argument aims to show that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that symbol manipulation is not sufficient for meaning, that computers running programs are like the philosopher in the room, manipulating symbols without understanding what they mean. Imagine the situation from the philosopher's perspective, sitting with the rule book, receiving incomprehensible squiggles, looking up responses, writing more incomprehensible squiggles, and sending them out. And at no point does understanding occur, at no point do the symbols acquire meaning. The philosopher remains ignorant of Chinese throughout the process despite producing perfect Chinese responses. And Searle's point is that if the philosopher does not understand Chinese, then neither does any computer system that works the same way, that processes inputs according to formal rules to produce outputs. And since all computer programs work by manipulating symbols according to formal rules, no computer program can produce genuine understanding, can produce semantics, no matter how sophisticated the program, how large the rulebook, how perfect the responses. The argument is directed against the computational theory of mind, against the idea that cognition is computation, that thinking is symbol manipulation, that minds are programs running on brains. And Searle argues that this view is false, that minds have more than computational properties, that understanding requires something beyond syntax, something like intentionality, the capacity for thoughts to be about things, to have meaning, and intentionality is not a computational property, is not something that emerges from symbol manipulation. And so computers, which are purely computational systems, cannot have genuine understanding, cannot have genuine intelligence, no matter how complex their programs. Visualize the difference between a human understanding Chinese and the system of the room, The human has intentional states, has thoughts that are about things, knows what words mean, knows what is being said, while the room system has only syntax, has only formal symbol manipulation, and the symbols in the room are not about anything, do not mean anything to the system, are just meaningless marks manipulated according to rules. And Searle argues that this difference is fundamental, that no amount of syntactic processing can produce genuine semantics, cannot bridge the gap between meaningless symbols and meaningful thoughts. The Chinese room argument has generated enormous discussion and numerous objections. The system's reply argues that while the philosopher does not understand Chinese, the system as a whole, the philosopher plus the rulebook plus the room, does understand Chinese, and understanding is a property of the system, not of the components. And Searle responds that this misses the point, that even considering the entire system, there is nothing that understands Chinese. The system is still just manipulating symbols and internalizing the rulebook. Imagining the philosopher memorizes all the rules does not help. The philosopher still does not understand Chinese, still is just following rules. The robot reply argues that a computer embedded in a robot body, with sensors and actuators, with the ability to interact with the world, could ground symbols in experience, could connect symbols to things, and this grounding would provide semantics, would provide understanding, and Searle responds that this just adds more symbol manipulation. The robot receives perceptual inputs, processes them through programs, produces motor outputs, but all of this is still syntactic, still formal symbol manipulation, and adding perception and action does not add semantics, does not add understanding. The robot is just a Chinese room with cameras and arms. The brain simulator reply argues that if the program simulated the actual brain processes involved in understanding Chinese, neuron by neuron, then running the program would produce understanding. Because understanding is what brains do, and the simulation reproduces what brains do. And Searle responds with the thought experiment of replacing neurons with silicon chips one by one, and asks whether, at some point, understanding suddenly disappears, and argues that if understanding depends on specific biological properties of neurons, then simulation is insufficient. And if understanding depends only on computational properties, then simulation has them, and still does not produce understanding, showing that computation is not enough. The Other Minds reply argues that we attribute understanding to other humans based on their behavior, and if a computer produces the same behavior, we should attribute understanding to it by the same reasoning. And Searle responds that this is an epistemological point about how we know others understand, but his argument is a metaphysical point about what understanding is, and behaviorally equivalent systems might differ in whether they genuinely understand, and the Chinese room shows that behavioral equivalence does not guarantee understanding. Supporters of strong AI have largely rejected the Chinese room argument, have argued that Searle begs the question by assuming there is something more to understanding than syntactic processing, that he relies on intuitions about the philosopher's lack of understanding without justifying those intuitions, and that if the system perfectly duplicates the behavior of a Chinese understander, then it is a Chinese understander. An understanding is not a mysterious inner property, but is constituted by the right functional organization, the right pattern of information processing, and the Chinese room system has that organization. The argument also raises questions about what understanding is, what makes the difference between genuine and merely apparent understanding, and whether there could be a fact of the matter about whether a system understands or whether understanding is something we attribute based on pragmatic considerations. And Searle argues that understanding involves consciousness, involves subjective experience, involves intentionality, and these are biological phenomena that cannot be duplicated by computation, while functionalists argue that understanding is a matter of functional organization, and any system with the right organization understands regardless of its physical implementation. The philosopher sits in the room, manipulating Chinese characters, following rules, producing perfect responses and understanding nothing, and the question remains whether this thought experiment refutes strong AI, whether it shows that computation is insufficient for understanding, or whether it merely trades on intuitions about the thought experiment that should not be trusted. And the Chinese room argument persists as one of the most influential arguments in philosophy of mind and AI, an argument that has shaped debates about consciousness, intentionality, and the nature of minds, an argument that continues to challenge the computational theory of mind. And the room remains. The philosopher remains, following rules, producing symbols, understanding nothing, and Searle's challenge endures, demanding explanation of how syntax could ever produce semantics, how symbol manipulation could ever produce meaning, and the argument stands as a permanent thorn in the side of strong AI, a thought experiment that forces advocates of computational theories to explain what their theories cannot easily explain, how understanding emerges from computation, how minds can be programs, and whether machines can think. The diamond water paradox: why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive. An economist observes that water is essential for life, is necessary for survival, is the most useful substance, and yet water is cheap, is almost free, costs nearly nothing in most places, while diamonds are useless for survival, are decorative luxuries, serve no biological function, and yet diamonds are expensive, cost fortunes, are among the most valuable commodities. And this seems paradoxical, seems to contradict the principle that value should reflect usefulness, that prices should correspond to importance. And this is the diamond water paradox, first discussed by Adam Smith, a puzzle about why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive, why things essential for life have low prices while things irrelevant to survival have high prices. And the paradox challenged early economic thinking, challenged the labour theory of value, which said that prices reflect the amount of labour required to produce goods. And the paradox remained unresolved until marginal utility theory was developed, until economists realised that value depends not on total utility, but on marginal utility, not on the usefulness of the entire quantity available, but on the usefulness of one additional unit. And water has high total utility. Life depends on it, but low marginal utility because we have abundant water, and one more gallon provides little additional benefit, while diamonds have low total utility but high marginal utility because diamonds are scarce, and one more diamond provides significant additional satisfaction to those who value them. And this insight resolved the paradox, showed that prices reflect scarcity and marginal benefit rather than total importance, and the diamond water paradox became a teaching example, became the canonical illustration of the difference between total and marginal value. Imagine your situation regarding water. You have access to abundant water, can drink whenever you want, can shower, can water plants, and the first glass of water each day is enormously valuable, prevents dehydration, sustains life. But by the time you've consumed several gallons, the marginal value of additional water is nearly zero. Additional water provides almost no benefit, and since price reflects the value of the marginal unit, the value of one more gallon, and since that marginal value is nearly zero, price is nearly zero, is very low, and this explains why water is cheap despite being essential. Because the marginal unit is not very valuable, because we have so much water that additional water is worth little. And now consider diamonds. You probably have no diamonds or very few, and the first diamond you acquire has significant value, provides aesthetic pleasure, provides status, and since diamonds are scarce, since you have few or none, the marginal value of an additional diamond is high. And since price reflects marginal value, price is high. And this explains why diamonds are expensive despite being non-essential. Because the marginal unit is very valuable. Because diamonds are scarce and additional, diamonds provide significant benefit to those who value them. The diamond water paradox demonstrates the importance of distinguishing total utility from marginal utility, shows that these can diverge dramatically, that goods with high total utility can have low marginal utility, and vice versa. And this distinction is fundamental to microeconomics, is the basis for understanding consumer choice, for deriving demand curves, for analysing how people allocate scarce resources, and marginal thinking about the value of additional units rather than the value of entire categories, is essential for economic reasoning. And the paradox illustrates why marginal thinking matters, why it produces different conclusions than total thinking, and resolving the paradox required economists to shift from thinking about total value to thinking about marginal value, to recognise that prices are determined at the margin, by the last unit exchanged, not by the average or total units. Visualise the marginal utility curves for water and diamonds. The marginal utility of water is high for the first units, the first gallons that prevent dehydration, but declines rapidly as consumption increases, as basic needs are satisfied, and at the quantity consumed, the marginal utility is low, is near zero, and price equals this low marginal utility, while the marginal utility of diamonds is high even at low quantities, because diamonds are scarce, because even wealthy people have relatively few diamonds. And at the quantity consumed, the marginal utility remains high, and price equals this high marginal utility. And this graphical representation makes the resolution clear, makes it visible that prices reflect marginal, not total utility, and the paradox dissolves once the distinction is understood. One implication of the diamond water paradox is about consumer surplus, the difference between what consumers would be willing to pay for all units and what they actually pay. And consumer surplus for water is enormous, is the difference between the life-saving value of the first units and the near-zero price paid, and consumers gain vastly more from water than they pay for it. While consumer surplus for diamonds is small, buyers pay prices close to their willingness to pay, and this shows that market prices do not reflect total value to consumers, do not capture the full benefit people receive, and the difference is consumer surplus is the unmeasured benefit. And understanding this helps explain why markets are beneficial, why trade creates value, because both buyers and sellers typically gain surplus, gain benefit beyond what they pay or receive. Another implication concerns necessity goods and luxury goods more generally. The paradox illustrates that necessities tend to be cheap, tend to have low prices relative to their importance, because necessities are typically abundant or because demand saturates quickly, because once basic needs are satisfied, marginal utility declines, while luxuries tend to be expensive, tend to have high prices relative to their importance, because luxuries are scarce or because demand does not saturate, because the wealthy always want more luxuries, and this pattern has implications for taxation. For understanding that taxing necessities is regressive, hits the poor harder, while taxing luxuries is progressive, hits the wealthy harder, and the paradox helps explain why economists typically advocate luxury taxes over necessity taxes, why sin taxes on non-essential goods are more acceptable than food taxes. The paradox also appears in discussions about water scarcity, because the resolution depends on water being abundant, depends on marginal utility being low, but in regions where water is scarce, the marginal utility of water rises dramatically, and prices should rise correspondingly, should reflect scarcity. And this suggests that in water-scarce regions, water should be expensive, should be priced to encourage conservation, to allocate scarce supplies efficiently, but such pricing is controversial, is seen as making a necessity unaffordable, and this creates political tension, creates conflict between economic efficiency, which requires high prices for scarce water, and social justice, which requires affordable water, and resolving this tension requires subsidies or tiered pricing or other interventions, and the paradox illuminates the trade-offs involved. Some argue that the diamond water paradox is not fully resolved, that even marginal utility theory leaves puzzles, because why do diamonds have high marginal utility? Why do people value diamonds? And the answer involves signaling, involves conspicuous consumption, involves diamonds serving as status symbols. And this is a different kind of value, is social rather than intrinsic. And understanding diamond value requires understanding social dynamics, understanding how luxuries signal wealth, how scarcity creates desirability, and this extends the resolution, shows that marginal utility can reflect social as well as physical properties, can reflect symbolic meaning as well as functional use. The paradox also connects to debates about labor theory of value, because Marx used labor theory, argued that value reflects socially necessary labor time, and the diamond water paradox is often seen as refuting labor theory, as showing that prices do not simply reflect labor inputs, because water requires little labor per gallon, but is essential, while diamonds require more labor but are luxury. But defenders of labor theory respond that the paradox misunderstands their theory, that labor theory concerns exchange value, not use value, concerns prices, not total utility, and that labor theory can accommodate the paradox by recognizing that scarcity affects prices, that supply and demand matter, and this debate continues, shows that the paradox remains relevant for understanding competing theories of value. Water flows abundantly, is drunk freely, costs almost nothing, and diamonds sit in vaults, are purchased rarely, cost fortunes, and the paradox stands: necessity is cheap and luxury expensive. Total utility diverges from price, and the resolution comes through marginal thinking, through recognizing that prices reflect the value of additional units, not the value of all units, through understanding that scarcity matters, that abundance reduces marginal value, and the diamond water paradox endures as one of the classic examples in economics, as the teaching tool for introducing marginal utility, as the illustration of why economic thinking requires focusing on the margin, on incremental changes, on additional units, and the paradox remains resolved but instructive, showing that value is context-dependent, is determined by scarcity and marginal benefit, and prices reflect the margin, not the total, and understanding this is fundamental to economic reasoning. The false belief paradox. Young children, typically before the age of 4 or 5, exhibit a curious cognitive limitation. They struggle to understand that other people can hold beliefs that differ from reality, that someone can believe something false, and this limitation is revealed through false belief tasks, experimental scenarios designed to test whether children can represent the mental states of others, can understand that beliefs are representations that can be accurate or inaccurate, and the classic version involves a character named Maxie who places chocolate in a cupboard and then leaves the room. And while Maxie is gone, his mother moves the chocolate to a drawer. And when Maxie returns, children are asked where Maxie will look for the chocolate. And young children, those who have not yet developed what psychologists call theory of mind, say that Maxie will look in the drawer where the chocolate actually is, failing to recognize that Maxie's belief, formed when the chocolate was in the cupboard, has not been updated, that Maxie still believes the chocolate is in the cupboard even though this belief is now false. This failure to attribute false beliefs to others might seem like a simple developmental limitation, a matter of cognitive immaturity that children outgrow, but it raises deep philosophical questions about the nature of belief, the development of self-consciousness, the relationship between mind and world, and whether the ability to represent false beliefs is necessary for full-fledged thought and agency. And some philosophers have argued that the false belief paradox reveals something fundamental about the structure of cognition, that understanding false belief requires a kind of meta-representational ability, the capacity to represent representations, to think about thoughts, to hold in mind simultaneously what is the case and what someone believes to be the case, and this capacity emerges relatively late in development and may be unique to humans or shared only with a few other cognitively sophisticated species. The paradox takes its name from the tension between two facts. On the one hand, beliefs are defined by their representational content, by what they are about, and this content can be accurate or inaccurate, true or false. And so the possibility of false belief seems built into the very concept of belief, seems to be part of what makes beliefs different from mere sensations or reflexes. And on the other hand, young children seem unable to grasp this possibility, seem to treat beliefs as transparent to reality, as if what someone believes must be what is actually the case. And this suggests that the full concept of belief, the concept that includes the possibility of misrepresentation, is not innate but develops over time, requiring both cognitive maturation and social experience. The false belief paradox also appears in philosophical discussions of self-knowledge and first-person authority, because while young children struggle to attribute false beliefs to others, they seem to have access to their own beliefs in a more direct way. They can report what they believe without needing to infer it from evidence, and this asymmetry between first-person and third-person belief attribution raises questions about whether beliefs are fundamentally different when considered from the inside versus the outside. Whether self-knowledge is a special kind of knowledge with its own logic and epistemology, and whether the difficulty of understanding false belief in others reflects a deeper puzzle about how minds can be both transparent to themselves and opaque to others. Some philosophers have connected the false belief paradox to issues of rationality and akrasia, the puzzle of how someone can act against their own better judgment, can believe that an action is wrong or foolish, and yet perform it anyway, because understanding akrasia seems to require the ability to represent conflicting mental states, to hold in mind both what one judges to be best and what one is inclined to do, and this ability may depend on the same meta-representational capacity that underlies the understanding of false belief, the capacity to separate belief from reality, to recognize that mental states are states that can be at odds with each other or with the world. The false belief paradox also has implications for moral responsibility and the development of moral understanding, because attributing blame or praise to someone requires understanding their beliefs and intentions, requires recognizing that they acted based on what they believed rather than what was actually the case. And young children who cannot represent false beliefs also struggle with certain moral judgments. They tend to judge actions by their outcomes rather than by the intentions behind them, and they have difficulty understanding that someone who causes harm unintentionally, based on a false belief about the situation, is less blameworthy than someone who causes harm intentionally. And this connection between false belief understanding and moral judgment suggests that moral development depends on cognitive development, that certain moral concepts require certain cognitive capacities. The paradox raises questions about animal cognition as well, about whether non-human animals can represent false beliefs, whether they have theory of mind, and experiments with primates, corvids, and other intelligent species have produced mixed results. Some studies suggest that great apes and some birds can pass modified versions of false belief tasks, suggesting they have at least rudimentary theory of mind, while other studies find failures, and the debate continues about what these results mean, whether animals that pass simplified tasks really understand false belief, or whether they are using simpler heuristics, behavioral rules that mimic understanding without genuine meta-representation. The false belief paradox also connects to discussions of autism and neurodiversity, because individuals with autism often struggle with theory of mind tasks, including false belief tasks, even into adulthood, and this difficulty has been proposed as part of what makes social interaction challenging for autistic individuals. The inability to easily and automatically infer what others believe, intend, or know. And this has led to both therapeutic interventions designed to teach theory of mind skills and critiques of the emphasis on theory of mind, with some arguing that the focus on false belief tasks pathologizes a different cognitive style rather than a deficit, that autistic individuals may process social information differently rather than poorly, and that neurotypical people also struggle to understand autistic minds, suggesting that theory of mind failures are bidirectional, not one-sided. The paradox persists as a puzzle about the nature of mind and the development of mental concepts, about how humans come to understand that minds are representational, that beliefs can be false, that people act based on what they think rather than what is, and the failure of young children to grasp false belief reveals something profound about cognition, that the ability to represent misrepresentation is not simple or automatic, but requires a developmental achievement, a cognitive leap that transforms how we understand ourselves and others. And once this leap is made, once false belief becomes comprehensible, the social world opens up in new ways. Deception becomes possible and recognizable. Mistakes become understandable, different perspectives become appreciable, and the realization that others see the world differently, that their beliefs may not match reality or our own beliefs, becomes the foundation for empathy, communication, cooperation, and conflict. The chocolate sits in the drawer, Maxie believes it is in the cupboard, and the child must hold these two facts in mind simultaneously, must represent reality and represent Maxie's representation of reality, and for the young child this is impossible. The two collapse into one, belief and reality merge, and Maxie must look where the chocolate is, not where he believes it to be. And the child's answer reveals a mind that has not yet learned to separate map from territory, representation from represented, belief from truth. And the false belief paradox marks the boundary between a simpler cognitive world, where beliefs are transparent, and a more complex one, where beliefs are understood as representations that can misrepresent, where minds are recognized as fallible, limited, perspectival, and where the gap between how things seem and how things are becomes a permanent feature of the social and epistemic landscape. And we who have crossed this boundary, who can easily attribute false beliefs to others, can only dimly remember what it was like before, what it was like when belief and reality were not distinguished, when other minds were opaque in a different way, not because we understood them as different, but because we did not yet understand them as minds at all. The flicker of freedom, the tiny space where choice still lives. A philosopher examines Frankfurt's counterexamples, the cases where a person acts on their own but could not have done otherwise because an intervener would have prevented any alternative. And Frankfurt argues these cases show that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that alternate possibilities are not necessary for free will. But philosopher Robert Caine and others have identified something Frankfurt missed, a detail in the structure of the cases that preserves a tiny alternative, a flicker of freedom, a moment where the person could have begun to choose differently before the intervener stopped them. And this flicker, though tiny, though insufficient to constitute full alternative action, might be enough to ground responsibility, might show that Frankfurt's cases do not actually eliminate alternatives, but only limit them. And if the flicker is necessary for responsibility, then the principle of alternate possibilities survives. Survives, in modified form, requires not robust alternatives, but only minimal alternatives, only flickers. And this is the flicker of freedom argument, the observation that Frankfurt cases contain residual alternatives, tiny spaces where choice still operates. And these flickers might be necessary and sufficient for responsibility. And the debate about Frankfurt cases becomes a debate about whether flickers matter, whether tiny alternatives count, whether responsibility requires robust alternatives or only minimal ones. And this debate has generated extensive literature, has forced refinement of Frankfurt's argument, has led to increasingly complex thought experiments designed to eliminate even flickers. And the question remains whether true flicker-free cases are possible, whether alternatives can be completely eliminated while responsibility is preserved, and the flicker of freedom persists as a challenge to Frankfurt's argument, as a defense of the principle of alternate possibilities, as a last stand for the view that responsibility requires alternatives. Imagine a Frankfurt case carefully, Jones is about to decide whether to vote for candidate A or candidate B, and Black, the intervener, has placed a device in Jones's brain that monitors his neural activity, and the device can detect which way Jones will decide before Jones becomes conscious of his decision, can detect the neural precursors of choosing B, and if the device detects these precursors, it will intervene, will alter Jones's brain to make him decide to vote for A instead. But if Jones is going to decide on his own to vote for A, then the device does nothing, remains dormant, and now suppose Jones decides on his own to vote for A. The device detects no precursors of choosing B because there are none. Jones was always going to choose A on his own, and so the device does nothing, and Jones votes for A based on his own decision. And Frankfurt says Jones is responsible, even though he could not have done otherwise. Because if he had started to choose B, the device would have intervened. And so Jones could not have voted for B, had no alternative. And yet Frankfurt says Jones is responsible, because he acted on his own, and the device played no role. But now consider the flicker. There is a moment, however brief, before the device detects that Jones is choosing B, before the device can intervene, and in that moment, Jones could have begun to choose differently, could have initiated the neural precursors that would have triggered intervention, and this moment is a genuine alternative. Is something Jones could have done differently, even though if he had done it, the device would have stopped him from completing the alternative choice. And so there is an alternative. There is something Jones could have done otherwise, namely, begin to choose B. And this alternative, though tiny, though incomplete, is a flicker of freedom. And the question is whether this flicker is sufficient to ground responsibility, whether the ability to begin an alternative is enough even if the ability to complete it is absent. Visualize freedom as coming in degrees. At one end is robust freedom, the full ability to choose and complete any available alternative. At the other end is no freedom, no alternatives whatsoever. And flickers are near the no freedom end, but not quite at it. Are minimal alternatives, are the ability to begin alternatives, even if not to complete them. And the debate is whether this minimal freedom is sufficient for responsibility, whether flickers count, or whether only robust alternatives matter. And source theorists who follow Frankfurt say flickers do not matter, say that what matters for responsibility is not alternatives, but source, whether the action flows from the agent's own will. And flicker theorists who defend alternate possibilities say flickers do matter, say that responsibility requires some alternative, even if minimal, even if only a flicker. Frankfurt responded to the flicker objection by constructing more sophisticated cases, blockage cases, where the intervener does not wait for precursors but intervenes earlier, or cases where the intervener controls the entire deliberative process, ensures that only one alternative is genuinely possible psychologically, and these refined cases attempt to eliminate even flickers, attempt to create scenarios where no alternative exists at any point, not even the alternative of beginning to choose differently. And if such flicker-free cases are possible, if they preserve responsibility, then Frankfurt's argument succeeds, shows that responsibility does not require alternatives, and the principle of alternate possibilities is refuted. But critics argue that truly flicker-free cases are impossible, that any case detailed enough to eliminate all flickers will either eliminate responsibility along with alternatives, or will preserve subtle flickers that defenders miss. And this back and forth, this attempt to construct and critique flicker-free cases, has dominated discussions of Frankfurt cases for decades, has generated increasingly technical papers, increasingly complex scenarios, and no consensus has emerged, and both sides claim victory, claim that the cases support their view, and the debate continues. The flicker of freedom also connects to debates about determinism and sourcehood, because if determinism is true, then flickers might not exist, might themselves be eliminated by deterministic causation, and so the flicker debate might ultimately depend on whether determinism is true, whether quantum indeterminacy provides space for genuine alternatives. And this makes the debate about flickers part of the larger debate about free will and determinism, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. One response to the flicker argument accepts that flickers exist in Frankfurt cases, but denies that flickers ground responsibility, argues that the ability to begin an alternative that would immediately be stopped is not the kind of ability that matters for responsibility, is not genuine control, is not enough to make the action truly up to the agent, and responsibility requires more than flickers, requires robust alternatives, or requires source without alternatives. And flickers are too weak to do the work that alternate possibilities theorists need them to do. And Frankfurt's argument succeeds despite the flickers, because flickers are irrelevant to responsibility. Another response embraces flickers, argues that they show Frankfurt cases fail, show that alternatives are preserved, and this response modifies the principle of alternate possibilities to say that responsibility requires alternatives, but these alternatives need not be robust, need only be flickers, need only be the ability to begin alternatives even if not to complete them. And this modified principle is immune to Frankfurt's argument because Frankfurt cases contain flickers, and flicker-free cases either do not exist or do not preserve responsibility, and so the principle of alternate possibilities survives in modified form, survives as the principle that responsibility requires. At least flickers of freedom requires some alternative possibilities, however minimal. The flicker debate also raises questions about what counts as an alternative, about how much control is required for something to be a genuine alternative, and these questions are central to understanding freedom, to specifying what free will requires, and the flicker debate, though technical, though focused on detailed cases, ultimately concerns fundamental issues about agency, control, and responsibility. And the debate has been productive, has forced clarification of concepts, has revealed complexity in notions that seemed simple, and whether flickers matter, whether they ground responsibility or are irrelevant, remains disputed, remains one of the many unresolved issues in the free will debate. Jones votes, the device does nothing, and somewhere in the process there is or is not a flicker, a moment where Jones could have begun differently, a tiny alternative that would have triggered intervention, and whether this flicker exists and whether it matters determine whether Frankfurt's argument succeeds, whether responsibility requires alternatives and the flicker of freedom remains, tiny but potentially crucial, a last gasp of alternate possibilities in cases designed to eliminate them. And the debate continues, philosophers constructing ever more sophisticated cases, critics finding ever more subtle flickers, and the question persists, do flickers matter? Are tiny alternatives enough for responsibility, or is responsibility about source not alternatives, about where choices come from, not what else could have been chosen, and the flicker flickers, at the edge of possibility, barely existing, possibly necessary, and the debate around it endures. The garden of forking paths where every choice splits reality. A writer imagines time as a garden of forking paths, a labyrinth where each decision creates a branching, where reality splits into multiple futures, one for each possible choice, and this image captures something deep about how we experience decision-making. We stand at forks, at moments where multiple paths lie ahead, and we choose which path to take. And unchosen paths remain as real possibilities, as roads not taken, and this multiplicity of possibilities, this forking structure of time, seems essential to freedom, seems to be what makes choice meaningful, because choosing requires alternatives, requires that other options be genuinely possible, genuinely available, and yet physics tells a different story, tells us that reality does not actually fork, that there is one actual future, one path that will be taken, and the other paths are mere possibilities, unreal, never actualized, and this creates tension between the subjective experience of forking paths and the objective reality of a single actual future. And this tension is what the Garden of Forking Paths represents. The conflict between the branching structure we experience and the linear structure physics describes. And resolving this tension requires understanding what possibilities are, whether they are real or merely epistemic, whether the Garden of Forking Paths is a feature of reality or only of our ignorance. And this is the Garden of Forking Paths problem, the question of how to reconcile freedom, which seems to require genuine alternatives, with determinism, which says only one future is possible. Imagine standing at a fork, two paths before you, and you must choose which to take. And both paths seem open, seem available, seem like real options, and you deliberate, consider reasons for each path, weigh consequences, and make a decision. And as you walk down the chosen path, you look back at the fork and see the unchosen path receding behind you. And that path represents what could have been, what might have happened. And this counterfactual, this alternative possibility seems essential to the meaning of your choice. Because if the unchosen path was never really possible, if you were always going to choose as you did, then the deliberation seems pointless, seems like theatre, and the choice seems less significant, less truly yours. And yet determinism says the unchosen path was never really possible, was never going to be actualized, was only possible in your ignorance of which path you would take. And the Garden of Forking Paths is a map of ignorance, not a map of reality, and the paths that seem to fork actually do not actually collapse to a single trajectory determined by past and laws. The Garden of Forking Paths is a metaphor from Jorge Luis Borges, from his story about a novel that represents time as forking, where every possible future exists in parallel, where the protagonist makes different choices in different branches, and all branches are real, all a part of the same story. And Borges uses this to explore ideas about time and possibility and narrative, and philosophers have adopted the metaphor to represent the libertarian view of free will. The view that when we make choices, reality genuinely branches, multiple futures exist, and our choice determines which branch becomes actual. And this contrasts with the compatibilist view, where the garden does not actually fork, where only one future was ever possible. And deliberation is about discovering which future is actual, rather than creating which future is actual. Visualize the metaphor more precisely. At each moment of choice, the timeline splits. One branch for voting for candidate A, and another for voting for candidate B. And both branches are real. Both exist as genuine possibilities, and the agent's choice makes one branch actual, and the other merely counterfactual. And if this picture is correct, then free will is preserved because genuine alternatives existed. But if this picture is wrong, if only one branch is real and the other is merely imagined, then free will is threatened. Then the agent never really had alternatives, never really chose between real possibilities, only discovered which possibility was actual all along. The Garden of Forking Paths connects to debates about the metaphysics of time, about whether the future is open or closed, whether future contingents have truth values, whether statements about what will happen tomorrow are true or false now, or are neither true nor false until tomorrow arrives. And open future theorists say the future is genuinely open, genuinely indeterminate. The garden genuinely forks, and multiple futures are possible, and closed future theorists say the future is already determined, already fixed. Only one future is possible, and the garden does not really fork, only appears to fork from our limited perspective. One response to the Garden of Forking Paths embraces the branching metaphor, adopts the growing block theory of time, where the past and present are real and the future is not yet real, is open, is genuinely undetermined. And as time progresses, the future becomes present and then past, and the timeline grows. And at moments of free choice, the timeline branches, multiple futures become actualized, and libertarian free will is preserved. But critics argue that this picture is inconsistent with physics, with relativity, which says that simultaneity is relative, that there is no objective present moment, and the growing block theory cannot be reconciled with relativity, and so the Garden of Forking Paths cannot be real, is only a convenient fiction. Another response denies the branching, accepts that only one future is real, and argues that free will does not require genuine branching, does not require that unchosen alternatives be real, but only requires that the agent's choice be the determining factor in which future is actualized. And as long as the agent's deliberation and decision play a causal role, as long as the action flows from the agent's own reasons and desires, the agent is free, and the Garden of Forking Paths is an epistemic representation, a map of what might happen from the agent's perspective, but not a metaphysical reality. And this compatibilist response preserves free will without requiring genuine metaphysical branching. A third response appeals to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, where every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into multiple branches, one for each possible outcome, and all branches are real. All exist in a vast multiverse, and human choices might involve quantum processes, might cause branching at the quantum level. And so the Garden of Forking Paths is literally real, is part of the structure of quantum reality. And every choice you make creates multiple versions of you in different branches. And free will is preserved because genuine branching occurs. Though this response raises questions about which branch is you, about personal identity across branches, about whether it matters that other branches exist if you can never observe them or interact with them. The Garden of Forking Paths also appears in discussions of regret and counterfactuals, because when we regret choices, we imagine the path not taken, imagine how things would have been if we'd chosen differently. And this imagining treats the unchosen path as a real possibility, as something that could have happened. And the question is whether this treatment is accurate, whether the unchosen path was genuinely possible, or was only possible in our imagination, only possible relative to our ignorance. And if only imaginary, then regret is irrational, is lamenting something that could never have been. And if genuinely possible, then regret is rational, is lamenting a real alternative that was available but not chosen. The writer walks through the garden, sees the paths forking ahead, sees the labyrinth of possibilities, and each fork represents a choice, a moment where the future is open, where alternatives exist, and the writer chooses again and again, and each choice closes off paths, eliminates possibilities, and the unchosen paths remain behind, fading into counterfactual space. And whether these unchosen paths are real, whether they exist somewhere in quantum multiverse or only in imagination, determines whether the Garden of Forking Paths is a true picture of reality or only a useful metaphor. And the question remains open, remains disputed, and the garden remains, branching or not branching, forking or merely appearing to fork. And we walk through it, choosing paths, deliberating at forks, and whether the alternatives are real or illusory. Whether the garden genuinely branches or only seems to, shapes how we understand freedom, how we interpret choice, and whether determinism eliminates the garden or merely reveals that it never really forked. And the metaphor endures, beautiful and problematic, a representation of how choice feels from the inside, even if not how choice is from the outside. And the Garden of Forking Paths remains a permanent fixture in discussions of free will, a vivid image that captures the experience of agency, even as physics and metaphysics question whether the image corresponds to reality. The hard problem of consciousness: why brain activity does not explain experience. A neuroscientist maps every neuron in the visual cortex, traces every connection, measures every firing pattern, understands completely the physical processes that occur when someone sees the color red, knows which wavelengths of light activate which photoreceptors, which signals travel along which pathways, which brain regions respond, and the scientist can predict with perfect accuracy when someone will report seeing red, can manipulate brain states to produce the experience, has complete knowledge of the physical mechanisms. And yet philosopher David Chalmers asks a question that this knowledge does not answer. Why is there something it is like to see red? Why does the physical processing produce a subjective experience, a quale, a feeling of redness that exists from the inside, from the first-person perspective? And this question is the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, to phenomenal consciousness, to the felt quality of mental states. And Chalmers distinguishes this from the easy problems, which are merely difficult scientific questions about how the brain processes information, how it integrates data, how it produces behavior. And while these easy problems are challenging, they are tractable, are problems science can solve through normal methods. But the hard problem is different, is a question of a different kind. Asks not how consciousness functions, but why it exists at all. Why there is subjective experience accompanying physical processes rather than those processes occurring without any inner experience, without anything it is like to undergo them. Imagine a zombie, a philosophical zombie, a creature that is physically identical to a human being, molecule for molecule, neuron for neuron, that behaves exactly like a human, says the same things, acts the same ways, but has no inner experience, no consciousness, is dark inside. And Chalmers argues that such a zombie is conceivable, is logically possible. And if zombies are possible, then consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And so consciousness must be something additional, something over and above the physical. And this is why the hard problem is hard, because it seems to require explaining how something non-physical, something subjective, emerges from something physical, something objective. And no amount of knowledge about brain function, about neural mechanisms, about information processing, seems to bridge this gap, seems to explain why there is something it is like rather than nothing. Visualize the explanatory gap. On one side is all the physical information, all the facts about brain states and neural firing and chemical processes. And on the other side is subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee. And the gap between these two sides seems unbridgeable. Seems like knowledge of one does not give knowledge of the other. And no matter how much we learn about brains, we do not seem to get closer to explaining why brains produce consciousness, why certain physical systems have inner lives. And this gap is what makes the hard problem hard, what makes consciousness seem mysterious, what makes it resist scientific explanation. The hard problem has generated multiple responses: materialists who deny that there is a hard problem, who argue that consciousness is reducible to physical processes, that once we fully understand the brain, we will understand consciousness, that the appearance of a gap is due to our current ignorance, and dualists who accept the hard problem and argue that consciousness is non-physical, is a separate substance or property that exists alongside the physical, and Mysterians who accept the hard problem but argue that it is unsolvable, that human cognitive capacities are limited, that we may never understand how consciousness arises from physical processes because our minds are not equipped to grasp the answer. One materialist response appeals to functionalism, argues that consciousness is not a separate thing, but is identical to certain functional roles, certain patterns of information processing, and what it is like to see red is just the functional role that seeing red plays in the cognitive system, the way it affects memory and behavior and other mental states. And this functional role can be fully captured physically, can be explained in terms of brain processes, and so there is no explanatory gap, no hard problem, only a conceptual confusion that disappears once we realize that consciousness is function and function is physical. Another materialist response appeals to eliminativism, argues that our ordinary concepts of consciousness are confused, are based on folk psychology that science will replace. And when neuroscience matures, we will abandon talk of subjective experience. We'll recognize that what we called consciousness was really just neural processes misdescribed, and the hard problem will dissolve because the phenomenon it concerns, subjective experience as we currently conceive it, does not exist. And this radical response rejects the starting point of the hard problem, rejects that there is anything subjective that needs explaining. Dualist responses accept that consciousness is irreducibly subjective, is not reducible to physical processes, and argue for property dualism, where consciousness is a non-physical property that physical systems can have, or substance dualism, where consciousness is a separate mental substance that interacts with the physical body. And these views face the interaction problem, the question of how non-physical consciousness can affect physical processes, how mental causation works, and dualists have proposed various answers, some appealing to fundamental psychophysical laws, others denying that consciousness has causal power, but none has achieved consensus. Mysterian responses associated with Colin McGinn accept that the hard problem is real, but argue that it is unsolvable by humans, that our cognitive architecture is not suited to understanding how consciousness arises from matter. Just as rats cannot understand quantum mechanics, humans cannot understand consciousness. And this is not a failure of science, but a limit of human cognition. And we should accept this limit, recognize that some questions are beyond us, and the hard problem is one of them. The hard problem also connects to the knowledge argument, to Mary, the colour scientist who knows all physical facts about colour but has never seen colour, and when she finally sees red for the first time, she learns something new, learns what red looks like, and this suggests that physical knowledge does not exhaust knowledge about consciousness, that there are facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts, and this supports the view that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, that the hard problem is real. The neuroscientist continues mapping neurons, continues discovering mechanisms, and the scientific progress is real, is impressive, reveals extraordinary complexity in how brains process information. But the hard problem remains. The question of why this processing feels like anything, why there is an inner light, why we are not zombies, and Chalmers's challenge persists, unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent limit on scientific explanation, or perhaps a confusion that will dissolve with better understanding. And philosophers and scientists continue to debate, continue to propose theories, continue to argue about whether consciousness is physical or non-physical, reducible or irreducible, explicable or mysterious, and the hard problem endures as one of the central problems in philosophy of mind, a problem that touches on the nature of reality, on the relationship between mind and matter, on what we are and what it means to be conscious. And the problem remains hard, stubbornly resistant to solution, a gap that knowledge does not seem to close, an explanatory challenge that persists despite centuries of reflection and decades of neuroscience, and consciousness continues to feel mysterious, continues to seem like something that physics cannot capture. And the hard problem stands as a monument to this mystery, a permanent reminder that subjective experience, the felt quality of mental life, resists reduction to objective physical processes. And whether this resistance reflects a genuine metaphysical divide, or merely our current conceptual limitations, remains one of philosophy's deepest and most difficult questions. The information paradox. What happens to information? When it falls into a black hole forms when a massive star collapses. Its gravity becomes so intense that nothing can escape, not even light, and the boundary beyond which escape is impossible is called the event horizon, a spherical surface surrounding the black hole, and anything that crosses this horizon is lost forever, pulled inexorably toward the central singularity where density becomes infinite, and the known laws of physics break down. And this seems straightforward. Black holes consume matter and energy, They grow as they absorb material, and information about what fell in is destroyed, erased from the universe. But this simple picture creates a profound paradox, because quantum mechanics insists that information cannot be destroyed, that the universe preserves a complete record of its state, that if you know the present perfectly, you can, in principle, reconstruct the past. And this principle of information conservation is fundamental to quantum theory, underlies the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And if information can be destroyed in black holes, then quantum mechanics is wrong, or incomplete, or requires modification. And this clash between black hole physics and quantum mechanics is the information paradox, first articulated clearly by Stephen Hawking in the 1970s and still not fully resolved despite decades of intense research. Imagine throwing a book into a black hole. The book contains information, words on pages encoding knowledge, and as the book falls toward the event horizon, it crosses that boundary and disappears. And an observer watching from outside can never retrieve the book, can never read its contents. The information seems lost, and if millions of books are thrown in, if stars and planets and entire galaxies are consumed, all that information vanishes and the black hole carries no record of what it ate. It is characterized completely by just three numbers: its mass, its electric charge, and its angular momentum, and everything else. All the details, all the structure, all the information about what fell in is gone. And this erasure of information violates quantum mechanics, violates unitarity, the principle that time evolution is reversible. That information is conserved, and so we face a dilemma: either quantum mechanics fails, or general relativity fails, or our understanding of black holes is incomplete. And all three options are troubling. All three challenge the foundations of modern physics. The paradox deepens when Hawking radiation is considered, because Hawking discovered in 1974 that black holes are not completely black. They emit thermal radiation. Due to quantum effects, near the event horizon, virtual particle pairs pop into existence just outside the horizon. One particle falls in and the other escapes, and this process causes the black hole to slowly evaporate, to lose mass over time, radiating energy into space, and eventually, after an immensely long time, the black hole evaporates completely, disappearing in a final burst of radiation. And the question arises: what happens to the information that fell in? Does it emerge in the Hawking radiation, encoded somehow in the particles that escape, or is it destroyed when the black hole evaporates? And Hawking initially argued that information is lost, that the radiation is purely thermal, completely random, carrying no information about what fell in. And this conclusion shocked the physics community, contradicted quantum mechanics, and triggered a debate that has lasted decades. Visualize the black hole evaporating, slowly shrinking as it radiates, and the radiation escaping as a stream of particles, photons, and other quanta. And these particles are hot, thermal, their properties determined by the black hole's temperature, and temperature is statistical, depends only on energy, not on the details of what produced the radiation. And so the Hawking radiation seems to carry no information about the book that fell in, about the stars that were consumed, about the specific configuration of matter that formed the black hole. And if the radiation carries no information, then when the black hole evaporates completely, when the last bit of mass is radiated away and the black hole vanishes, the information is gone, erased from the universe, and quantum mechanics is violated. And this is Hawking's original conclusion: information is lost. And this creates the paradox. Many physicists rejected this conclusion, argued that information must somehow be preserved, that the radiation must carry subtle correlations, quantum entanglements that encode the information in ways that are not obvious, that appear thermal locally but contain hidden structure globally. And this view, that information is preserved, requires that the Hawking radiation is not purely thermal but contains incredibly subtle quantum correlations that encode everything that fell in. And these correlations would be fantastically complex, impossible to detect in practice, but they must exist to preserve unitarity, to maintain consistency with quantum mechanics. And this led to proposals about how information might escape, perhaps through quantum corrections to Hawking's calculation, perhaps through the interior structure of black holes being more complex than classical general relativity suggests, perhaps through the holographic principle, which says that all information in a region of space can be encoded on its boundary. And so information that falls into a black hole is actually stored on the event horizon, not lost inside, and gradually released as the black hole evaporates. The debate between information loss and information preservation became one of the most important controversies in theoretical physics, with Hawking on one side arguing for loss and most of the quantum mechanics community on the other arguing for preservation, and the stakes were high. If information is lost, then quantum mechanics needs revision. If information is preserved, then general relativity, or our understanding of black hole interiors, needs revision. And either way, fundamental physics faces a crisis. And the paradox drove research in string theory, quantum gravity, holography, and black hole thermodynamics. And gradually, a consensus emerged that information is probably preserved, that Hawking radiation is not purely thermal, but carries information in subtle quantum correlations, though the details of how this works remain contentious and incomplete. Hawking eventually conceded the argument, famously changed his mind in 2004, and admitted that information is probably preserved, though he did not provide a complete mechanism, and the information paradox remains partially resolved. The community believes information is preserved, but lacks a complete detailed understanding of how information encoded in matter that falls into a black hole is transferred to the Hawking radiation that comes out. And this question touches on the deepest issues in quantum gravity, on the unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics, on the nature of space-time at the Planck scale, and on the limits of what can be known about the interior of black holes. And the paradox endures as a driving force in theoretical physics, a puzzle that has inspired new ideas, new mathematics, new ways of thinking about space and time and information. The book falls across the horizon, its pages fluttering, its words disappearing, and the black hole absorbs it, grows slightly more massive, and eventually the black hole evaporates. Hawking radiation streaming out, particles escaping, and somewhere in that radiation, encoded in correlations too subtle to detect, the information about the book survives, preserved by the laws of quantum mechanics, hidden but not destroyed. And the paradox resolves, not by destroying information, but by recognizing that black holes are more subtle than they seem, that the event horizon is not a simple boundary, but a complex quantum surface, that the interior is not a simple void, but a region where space-time and quantum mechanics intertwine in ways we are only beginning to understand. And the information paradox remains, solved in principle, but not in detail, a monument to the challenge of reconciling quantum mechanics and gravity, and a reminder that black holes, mysterious and powerful, continue to teach us about the fundamental nature of reality, about the limits of our theories, and about the deep connections between information, entropy, and the structure of space-time.